He did not start as a monster. He started as a poet, a young man from the mountains of Georgia, writing romantic verses about his homeland, about flowers and birdsong, about the beauty of the Caucasus. He signed them with a pen name. His real name was Ioseb Jugashvili. The world would later know him as Joseph Stalin. And the poetry he once wrote would one day be read in the same country where his signature on a single document could mean that a man, a woman, or even a child disappeared forever. How does a person go from writing love poems to becoming one of the most powerful and feared rulers in all of human history? How does someone build a system so vast, so all-consuming, that it could swallow millions of lives and still keep running? Still keep the trains on time, still launch satellites into space, still win a world war? That is the question at the heart of everything you are about to hear. And I want to warn you right now, some of what comes next may challenge what you think you already know about this man. Because the truth about Stalin is not a simple story of evil. It is something far more complicated, far more disturbing, and far more human than that. Stay with me until the end, because the final detail, the one that historians still argue about today, might completely change how you see everything that came before it. Welcome back to Dark History USSR, the channel where we go beneath the surface of the Soviet story and find the parts that textbooks left out. If you are new here, welcome. You are going to want to stick around for this one. And before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We have viewers from Kiev to Vladivostok, from New York to Buenos Aires, and we love knowing where our community is tuning in. Tell us your city, your country, wherever you are, we read every single one. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It takes just a second, and it genuinely helps us keep making these deep dive histories for you. Now let's go back, way back, to a small, dusty town in the Caucasus, where this story truly begins. The town was called Gori. It sits in what is now the modern country of Georgia, nestled between rolling hills and the cool blue ribbon of the Kara River. In the late 19th century, it was a provincial backwater, a place of cobbled streets, Orthodox churches, and lives lived close to the bone. It was here, on the 18th of December, 1878, that Ekaterine Geladze gave birth to a son she named Ioseb. His mother, known to everyone as Kiki, was a deeply religious woman. His father, Besso, was a cobbler, a man with a quick temper and an even quicker hand. The family was poor, not the romantic poverty of folklore, but the grinding, humiliating kind, the kind where cold is a fact of life and hunger is a regular visitor. Besso drank, and when Besso drank, young Ioseb suffered. The beatings were severe enough that neighbors noticed, severe enough that they left marks both visible and invisible. Some biographers believe this early violence shaped something deep inside the boy, a rage carefully buried, and a determination that he would never again be the one on the receiving end of power. But Kiki had a plan for her son. She was a woman of iron will, and she saw in Ioseb something worth fighting for. She arranged for him to attend the Gori church school, and then, her greatest achievement, she secured him a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary in the Georgian capital, which is known today as Tbilisi. This was, for a boy of his background, a remarkable opportunity. The seminary was intended to produce priests. Instead, it produced something the Russian Empire had not anticipated. It produced a revolutionary. Inside the seminary's thick stone walls, Ioseb Jugashvili did something dangerous, he read. Not the prescribed texts, not the approved theological works, but the forbidden books that circulated hand to hand among the students. He discovered Karl Marx. He discovered the idea that history was not the story of great men or divine providence, but of class struggle, of oppressors and the oppressed, of systems that could be torn down and rebuilt. For a boy who had grown up watching his father drink away what little they had, who had felt helpless against violence he could not control, these ideas were not abstract. They were personal. He was expelled from the seminary in 1899, officially for failing to appear for an exam, though historians suspect the real reasons were more political. It didn't matter. By then, young Ioseb had already found his true vocation. He joined the underground revolutionary movement. He organized workers. He wrote pamphlets. He agitated, argued, and plotted in smoke-filled back rooms. He adopted a series of revolutionary pseudonyms, eventually settling on one that would define him: Stalin. In Russian, it means man of steel. Over the following years, Stalin built a reputation as someone who got things done, and who was willing to do things others were not. He organized strikes. He ran underground printing presses. He planned robberies, what the Bolsheviks called expropriations, to fund the revolutionary cause. The most famous of these was the Tiflis bank robbery of 1907, in which a gang he coordinated threw bombs into a busy public square and made off with a fortune in government money. People died in the chaos. Stalin was not there in person. He rarely was. But the operation was his. He was arrested multiple times by the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, and sent to exile in Siberia. He escaped multiple times. A feat that, in those days, required both courage and connections. And here is something worth pausing on. There are historians who have raised uncomfortable questions about the pattern of Stalin's arrests and escapes. Some have suggested that he may have been, at certain points in his early career, an informant for the Okhrana, feeding information about his fellow revolutionaries in exchange for favorable treatment. The evidence is incomplete. The case is disputed. But the documents that might settle the question definitively have a habit of being inaccessible, destroyed, or reclassified. It is a shadow that has never fully lifted from his early biography. What is not in dispute is that by the time Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, the famous revolution that upended the Russian Empire, Stalin had positioned himself as one of the movement's indispensable operators. He was not a great theorist like Lenin, not a brilliant orator like Trotsky, but he understood something that both of them underestimated: the power of paperwork, of bureaucracy, of controlling who got what job, who got what party membership, who got access to what resources. While others gave speeches, Stalin built files. In 1922, he was appointed to the newly created position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. Most of his colleagues thought it was a boring administrative role beneath serious men of ideas. Lenin himself grew alarmed almost immediately. In what became known as Lenin's Testament, a document he dictated in the final months of his life, he warned his colleagues that Stalin had concentrated enormous power in his hands and expressed doubt about whether he would always use that power with sufficient caution. Lenin recommended that Stalin be removed from the General Secretary post. He called him rude, disloyal, and capricious. The warning was suppressed. Lenin died in January 1924. The power struggle that followed was exactly the kind of contest Stalin had been preparing for without anyone realizing it. One by one, his rivals were outmaneuvered, discredited, expelled, or, in due course, killed. Leon Trotsky, the most brilliant of them, was eventually forced into exile and assassinated in Mexico City in 1940 by an agent with an ice axe. By the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin was the unchallenged ruler of the Soviet Union, and the terror had not yet begun. When people talk about Stalin's crimes, they often begin with the Great Purge of the late 1930s. But the first great catastrophe of his rule came earlier, and in some ways it was the more intimate horror. In 1928, Stalin announced the first five-year plan, a program to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union by forcing peasants off their individual plots and into collective farms, known as kolkhozy. The logic, as presented, was straightforward. Large collective farms would be more efficient, would produce more food, and would free up labor for the factories being built across the country. In practice, what followed was a disaster of almost incomprehensible scale. The peasantry of the Soviet Union, and particularly of Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Kazakhstan, resisted. They had little reason to trust a government that was taking everything they owned. In response, the regime branded the more prosperous peasants kulaks, a term originally meaning fists or tight fists, used to describe wealthier farmers, and declared them class enemies to be liquidated as a class. What this meant in practice was deportation, imprisonment, execution, and dispossession visited upon millions of families. Then came the hunger. The collective farms produced less, not more. The procurement brigades sent to take grain from the villages took everything, seed grain included, the grain that farmers needed to plant the next harvest. In Ukraine especially, the results were catastrophic. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of people starved to death. The exact number remains a matter of historical debate, but most serious estimates range from 3.5 million to 7 million deaths in Ukraine alone, with additional millions dying in Kazakhstan and other regions. The Ukrainian famine, known as the Holodomor, from the Ukrainian words for hunger and extermination, was hidden from the world. Foreign journalists who tried to report on it were pressured, discredited, or simply denied access. The Welsh journalist Gareth Jones, who smuggled himself into the affected regions and reported honestly on what he saw, was publicly denounced by other correspondents who had chosen to look away. The Soviet government denied that any famine was taking place. And while people were dying in their millions on the Ukrainian steppe, Stalin continued to export grain abroad. The question of whether the Holodomor constitutes genocide is one that courts, parliaments, and historians continue to debate. Dozens of countries have formally recognized it as genocide. Others argue that while the policies were deliberate, the specific intent to destroy the Ukrainian people as a group, the legal standard for genocide, has not been conclusively proven. What is not debated is this: the deaths happened. The grain was taken. The borders were sealed to prevent the starving from leaving in search of food. And Stalin knew. If collectivization was the regime's war against the peasantry, the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 was its war against everyone else, including itself. It began with a murder. On the 1st of December 1934, Sergei Kirov, the popular Leningrad party boss, widely seen as a potential rival or successor to Stalin, was shot dead in a corridor of Smolny Institute by a young party member named Leonid Nikolaev. Stalin arrived in Leningrad the next day, personally interrogated suspects, and used the assassination as the justification to launch a sweeping campaign against enemies of the people. Here, too, history holds a shadow question. Decades of research, including the post-Soviet opening of certain KGB archives, have led a number of serious historians to conclude that Kirov's assassination was arranged, or at least facilitated, by Stalin himself. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. The inexplicable failures of Kirov's security detail, the suspicious death of the NKVD officer assigned to investigate the case shortly after the killing, and the remarkable convenience of the murder for Stalin's political purposes. Others maintain that Nikolaev acted alone, motivated by personal grievances. The question remains, as so many questions about Stalin do, uncomfortably open. What is beyond doubt is what came after. The Great Purge, also called the Yezhovshchina, named after NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, who directed much of it, consumed the Soviet elite with a ferocity that astonished even those who had built the system. Old Bolsheviks who had fought alongside Lenin were dragged into show trials, forced through weeks or months of psychological torture and interrogation, and made to confess, publicly in open court before the world's press, to crimes they had not committed: sabotage, espionage, conspiracy with foreign powers, Trotskyite wrecking. The confessions were, almost without exception, false. The methods used to extract them were not subtle: sleep deprivation, threats against family members, beatings, psychological manipulation designed to break a person's sense of reality until they would say anything, sign anything, just to make it stop. Some of the accused signed their confessions with a kind of defiant resignation, knowing they were going to die regardless, and hoping that a public confession might spare their families. Often it did not. The purge consumed the Red Army with particular thoroughness. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were shot. 13 of 15 army commanders were shot. 50 of 57 Army Corps commanders were shot. 154 of 186 division commanders were shot. The army that would have to face the German Wehrmacht in just a few years was systematically decapitated, its most experienced officers replaced by younger men chosen more for political reliability than military competence. The consequences of this decision would be measured in blood when Germany invaded in June 1941. Beyond the military, the purge reached into every institution: the party, the government, the arts, the sciences, the universities. An estimated 680,000 people were executed during the peak years of the terror alone. Millions more were sent to the Gulag, the vast network of labor camps spread across Siberia and the far north, where prisoners worked in conditions of extreme brutality to build canals, mine gold, and fell timber. The total number of those who passed through the Gulag system across Stalin's rule is estimated at somewhere between 15 and 18 million. The number who died there is harder to calculate but runs into the millions. To understand the Gulag is to understand something essential about how Stalinist power operated. The camps were not merely a system of punishment. They were an economic engine. The gold mined at Kolyma, the timber felled in the Siberian taiga, the canals dug by hand through frozen ground, the railway lines hammered across landscapes where no free worker would have gone. All of this was produced by unfree labor, by men and women who had been assigned a sentence of 5, 10, 25 years on the basis of accusations that might be as specific as anti-Soviet agitation or as vague as socially dangerous element. The conditions varied by camp, by year, and by the resources available to a particular administration. But at their worst, and particularly during the war years when rations were cut to minimum, they were lethal. Prisoners subsisted on bread and thin gruel, worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could drop to negative 50 degrees Celsius, slept in overcrowded barracks, and received almost no medical care. The camps had their own internal hierarchies, their own economies of favors and violence, their own languages and codes. They produced a body of literature, written in secret, memorized by survivors, smuggled out at the cost of lives, that stands as one of the great testaments to human endurance. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, himself a Gulag survivor, spent years collecting testimonies and records that he wove into the Gulag archipelago. a work that, when it reached the West in the 1970s, did more than perhaps any other single text to force a reckoning with what had actually happened inside the Soviet Union. Varlam Shalamov, who spent 17 years in the Kolyma camps, wrote his Kolyma tales with a bleakness so total that it reads less like fiction than like dispatches from the edge of what a human being can survive. These were not marginal figures. They were witnesses to a system that, at its peak, held millions of people simultaneously. And here I want to pause and ask you something, because this is the kind of question that I think about constantly when I research these videos, and I genuinely want to know what you think. We know the numbers, we know the methods, we know the scale, but here is the question. Do you think it is possible to understand how ordinary people, guards, bureaucrats, interrogators, neighbors who denounced neighbors, participated in and enabled a system like this? Or does that level of complicity place itself beyond understanding? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and this is genuinely one of the most important questions in modern history. In the summer of 1941, history interrupted the terror. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, sending over 3 million troops across Soviet borders along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The attack caught Stalin in a state of paralysis that has never been entirely explained. Despite warnings from his own intelligence services, from British intelligence, from the American government, from German deserters who crossed the lines and told Soviet border troops that the attack was coming at dawn. Despite all of this, Stalin refused to fully mobilize or alert his forces. When the bombs began to fall, Soviet aircraft were still lined up neatly on airfields, destroyed on the ground within hours. The first weeks of the war were catastrophic. Entire armies were encircled and captured. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of kilometers in days. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Stalin appears to have suffered something close to a psychological breakdown. He retreated to his dacha and was essentially unreachable for several days. His inner circle, terrified, unsure whether he had simply withdrawn in anguish or was waiting to see if they would come to remove him, eventually came to him. What they found was a man who seemed to expect a rest. Instead, they asked him to lead. And lead he did, whatever his failings, and they were catastrophic, particularly in those first months. Stalin's role in the Soviet war effort was real and substantial. He made decisions of enormous consequence, some of them brilliant and some of them terrible. He refused to abandon Moscow in the autumn of 1941, when German forces were close enough that the city's fall seemed days away, a decision that historians credit with steadying a collapsing defense. He oversaw the extraordinary logistical feat of moving entire factory complexes, machinery, workers, everything thousands of kilometers east, out of the path of the German advance, and setting them back up to produce weapons again within weeks. He also ordered Order 227, not one step back, which instituted barrier troops behind the Soviet lines, with instructions to shoot any soldier who retreated without authorization. The order sent a shudder through the Red Army, but it reflected the brutal arithmetic of a war that was being lost. The Soviets suffered losses that are almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates of total Soviet war dead, military and civilian, range from 27 million to as many as 40 million people. The war consumed an entire generation. Victory came on the 9th of May 1945, and it was, in the most literal sense, a Soviet victory. The Red Army did the vast majority of the fighting on the Eastern Front, which was by far the largest and most brutal theater of the entire war. For Soviet citizens, the Great Patriotic War became the defining national experience of the century. A crucible of suffering so intense that it fused national identity in ways that are still visible in Russian culture today. And at the center of that narrative stood Stalin. The victory made him, if anything, more dangerous. The prestige he gained from leading the Soviet Union through the war gave him an authority that was almost impossible to challenge. The late Stalinist period, from 1945 until his death in 1953, was in many ways a return to the atmosphere of the late 1930s. New purges were prepared. New show trials were planned. The Doctor's Plot of 1952 and 53, in which a group of predominantly Jewish physicians were accused of planning to murder Soviet leaders, showed the same machinery of accusation and terror being readied for use again. Whether another mass terror was genuinely imminent when Stalin died is something historians debate. What is clear is that in his final years, he was increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, and increasingly erratic. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He trusted almost no one. Members of his inner circle, men like Molotov, Mikoyan, Voroshilov, found themselves potentially on lists, unsure whether their next summons to the Kremlin would be a dinner invitation or something else entirely. Molotov's wife had already been arrested. Mikoyan later, coming at dawn, Despite all of this, Stalin refused to fully mobilize or alert his forces. When the bombs began to fall, Soviet aircraft were still lined up neatly on airfields, destroyed on the ground within hours. The first weeks of the war were catastrophic. Entire armies were encircled and captured. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of kilometers in days. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Stalin appears to have suffered something close to a psychological breakdown. He retreated to his dacha and was essentially unreachable for several days. His inner circle, terrified, unsure whether he had simply withdrawn in anguish or was waiting to see if they would come to remove him, eventually came to him. What they found was a man who seemed to expect arrest. Instead, they asked him to lead, and lead he did, whatever his failings, and they were catastrophic, particularly in those first months. Stalin's role in the Soviet war effort was real and substantial. He made decisions of enormous consequence, some of them brilliant and some of them terrible. He refused to abandon Moscow in the autumn of 1941, when German forces were close enough that the city's fall seemed days away, a decision that historians credit with steadying a collapsing defense. He oversaw the extraordinary logistical feat of moving entire factory complexes, machinery, workers, everything thousands of kilometers east, out of the path of the German advance, and setting them back up to produce weapons again within weeks. He also ordered Order 227, not one step back, which instituted barrier troops behind the Soviet lines, with instructions to shoot any soldier who retreated without authorization. The order sent a shudder through the Red Army, but it reflected the brutal arithmetic of a war that was being lost. The Soviets suffered losses that are almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates of total Soviet war dead, military and civilian, range from 27 million to as many as 40 million people. The war consumed an entire generation. Victory came on the 9th of May 1945, and it was, in the most literal sense, a Soviet victory. The Red Army did the vast majority of the fighting on the Eastern Front, which was by far the largest and most brutal theater of the entire war. For Soviet citizens, the Great Patriotic War became the defining national experience of the century. A crucible of suffering so intense that it fused national identity in ways that are still visible in Russian culture today. And at the center of that narrative stood Stalin. The victory made him, if anything, more dangerous. The prestige he gained from leading the Soviet Union through the war gave him an authority that was almost impossible to challenge. The late Stalinist period, from 1945 until his death in 1953, was in many ways a return to the atmosphere of the late 1930s. New purges were prepared. New show trials were planned. The Doctor's Plot of 1952 and 53, in which a group of predominantly Jewish physicians were accused of planning to murder Soviet leaders, showed the same machinery of accusation and terror being readied for use again. Whether another mass terror was genuinely imminent when Stalin died is something historians debate. What is clear is that in his final years, he was increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, and increasingly erratic. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He trusted almost no one. Members of his inner circle, men like Molotov, Mikoyan, Voroshilov, found themselves potentially on lists, unsure whether their next summons to the Kremlin would be a dinner invitation or something else entirely. Molotov's wife had already been arrested. Mikoyan later recalled that every member of the Politburo knew, by the early 1950s, that none of them could feel safe. And then, on the 5th of March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The official account is that he suffered a stroke in the night, was found in the morning, and died several days later without regaining consciousness. This account is probably true. But, and here is the shadow that falls across even the very end of his story, it is not entirely beyond question. Several of the men who were with him in those final days, including Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the secret police, had the most powerful personal motives imaginable to ensure that Stalin did not recover. Beria himself, by some accounts, was almost gloating in the hours after Stalin's collapse. Whether he or anyone else took any action to hasten the end, or simply took action to delay medical assistance, is something that cannot be proven from the available evidence. What is certain is that when news of his death was finally announced, the response of the Soviet public was not what an outside observer might have expected.
Millions wept.
Genuinely. In a public crush near the Hall of Columns where Stalin lay in state, hundreds of people were killed in the stampede. The crowd so dense, so desperate to see him one last time, that people were crushed against lampposts and iron railings. The grief was real, and it was enormous, and it is one of the most psychologically complex facts about the entire Stalin era. How do you build a system in which people genuinely mourn the man who terrorized them? This is perhaps the most disturbing question the Stalin era poses to us. The answer lies in the mechanics of the cult of personality, a phrase that Khrushchev himself would use in his famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, in which he denounced Stalin's crimes before an audience of stunned party officials who had spent their careers in his service. The cult was not merely propaganda in the simple sense. It was a total environment, a managed reality in which Stalin's name, image, and supposed wisdom permeated every aspect of life. His portrait hung in every office, every classroom, every factory. His words were quoted on the radio, in newspapers, in speeches at every level of society. Cities were renamed after him. The highest mountain in the Soviet Union was renamed Stalin Peak. Children learned to address letters to Comrade Stalin as a school exercise. In this environment, information about the terror was very carefully managed. Many Soviet citizens genuinely did not know the full scale of what was happening, or, more precisely, they knew in a certain way and did not know in another. They knew that people disappeared. They knew that accusations were dangerous. They knew not to ask too many questions. But they did not have access to the aggregate picture, the numbers, the scope, the systematic nature of it, that we can now see from the historical record. The terror worked partly by making itself invisible at the systemic level while remaining entirely visible at the personal level. You knew your neighbor had been taken away. You did not know that hundreds of thousands of neighbors were being taken away. And woven through all of it was a genuine conviction held by many, including many who suffered under the system, that Stalin himself was good, that the problems were caused by those around him, that if only he knew what was really happening, he would stop it. Stalin doesn't know became a kind of psychological refuge, a way of preserving faith in the leader even as the evidence of his direct involvement in terror accumulated all around. It was, in its way, a remarkable testament to the power of manufactured reality, and to the profound human need to believe in a protector, even a terrifying one. Stalin's legacy is one of the most contested in all of modern history. In the years immediately after his death, Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign removed his image from public places, renamed cities and streets, and released millions of Gulag prisoners. His body was removed from the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square and buried, more modestly, near the Kremlin wall. He was not rehabilitated, but he was, for a time, diminished. But the story did not end there. In Russia today, polls consistently show that significant portions of the population regard Stalin favorably, as the leader who industrialized the country, who won the war, who made the Soviet Union a superpower. A survey conducted in the 21st century found that Stalin ranked among the most admired historical figures in Russia. This is not simply the result of ignorance. It reflects a genuine ambivalence, a weighing of costs and achievements that comes out differently depending on which costs and which achievements you emphasize, and whose testimony you trust. In Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in Georgia itself, the country of his birth, the picture is entirely different. In these places, the Holodomor, the deportations, the Gulag, and the cultural suppressions are living memories, still carried in family stories, in the gaps in family trees where grandfathers and great-aunts used to be. The debate over how to remember Stalin is, in this sense, not merely an academic exercise. It is a live political and moral argument about identity, justice, and what kind of history a society chooses to carry. Historians have approached him from almost every conceivable angle. Robert Conquest established the scale of his crimes in works that were long dismissed in the West as Cold War exaggerations, and then confirmed by the archive openings of the 1990s. Simon Sebag Montefiore rendered him as a fully human political animal in his magisterial biographies, a man capable of great warmth with his inner circle even as he signed death warrants by the thousands. Stephen Kotkin, in his monumental 3-volume biography, situates Stalin within the structures of the Bolshevik system, arguing that Stalinism was not the aberration of one psychopathic individual but the logical culmination of a certain kind of revolutionary politics. Each of these readings contains truth, and perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: what happened under Stalin was not made possible by Stalin alone. It was made possible by a system built on ideas, on institutions, on the participation of millions of ordinary people who made thousands of small choices that added up to something monstrous. The guards who worked the camps, the interrogators who extracted the confessions, the neighbors who signed the denunciations, the factory directors who met their quotas for arrests, the journalists who looked away. None of them were, in isolation, the architect of the horror. All of them were its builders. And now I want to share with you the detail I mentioned at the very beginning, the one that historians still argue about, the one that has never been fully resolved, the one that might make you see this entire story differently. For decades, the consensus view of Stalin's psychology was that he was, whatever else he might have been, a true believer, a man who genuinely embraced the Marxist-Leninist ideology he used to justify his actions, who sincerely believed he was building socialism, who thought that the suffering he caused was a necessary price for historical progress. This was the view of many of his contemporaries and of many early historians. But there is another possibility, one that has been seriously advanced by a number of scholars, including in materials that emerged from the Soviet archives. What if Stalin did not believe a word of it? There are moments scattered across the historical record that suggest something more cynical. A man using ideology as a tool, as a language of power, rather than as a genuine faith. His private conversations, as recorded by those around him, sometimes reveal a contempt for the very pieties he demanded others perform. His relationship with Marxist theory was always more pragmatic than scholarly. He imposed a simplified, rigid version of it that served his political purposes, and he was not above rewriting theoretical orthodoxy when it suited him. His private annotations on documents sometimes include remarks that suggest not conviction but calculation. And then there is this, something that emerged from archival research and that has generated remarkable controversy in academic circles. Among Stalin's personal papers preserved after his death, researchers found evidence that he had read, annotated, and in some cases apparently admired certain texts that were fundamentally incompatible with Marxist-Leninist ideology, including works by Russian nationalist and even pre-revolutionary conservative thinkers. If ideology was his genuine creed, why was he reading its intellectual enemies and marking passages approvingly? The implications of this possibility are, in a sense, more disturbing than the alternative. If Stalin was a true believer, however monstrous his beliefs, there is at least a kind of tragic logic to it. A man who convinced himself that the ends justified the means and paid a terrible price in other people's lives for that conviction. But if he was not a true believer, if he was, at the deepest level, a man who used an entire ideology, an entire civilization, as a vehicle for the acquisition and maintenance of personal power, then something else entirely was at work. Something colder. Something without even the tragic dignity of conviction. We do not know for certain. The archives are still not fully open. The man himself is not available for questioning. And the problem with Stalin, perhaps the deepest problem, is that he was, throughout his life, extraordinarily good at not being fully known. Let me tell you something about the man in private, because this too is part of the story, and it is part that surprises almost everyone who encounters it for the first time. Stalin was, by multiple accounts, a genuinely cultured man in certain respects. He read voraciously. His personal library contained over 20,000 books, many of them heavily annotated in his own hand. He loved Russian literature, particularly the poetry of his fellow Georgian, Nicholas Baratashvili, and the novels of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He had a genuine passion for music, especially opera. He attended the Bolshoi Theater regularly and had strong opinions about performance. When he listened to recordings late at night in his office or at the dacha, the staff knew not to disturb him. He was, with his inner circle, capable of startling warmth. Raucous dinners that went on until 4 in the morning, filled with Georgian toasts and terrible jokes and sing-alongs and a kind of forced intimacy that was, at the same time, genuinely intimate. Nikita Khrushchev, who spent years in this inner circle and who would later denounce Stalin's crimes, nonetheless described those evenings with a complexity that clearly made him uncomfortable. There was something real there, something human, even as the man could have you shot the next morning. He suffered real losses. His second wife, Nadezhda Alalieva, killed herself in November 1932 after a quarrel with him at a dinner party. She left a letter that was deeply critical of him. A letter whose contents he apparently never shared with anyone. Whether the loss affected him, whether it changed him, is something those around him wondered about but could not answer. His daughter, Svetlana, who eventually defected to the West and wrote about her father with remarkable candor, described a man whose capacity for affection was real but fitful and dangerous. A man who could play the tender father one day and look through her the next. His son Yakov, from his first marriage, was captured by the Germans in the early months of the war. The Germans proposed an exchange, Yakov for a captured German field marshal. Stalin refused. "I have no son named Yakov," he reportedly said. Yakov died in German captivity in 1943, throwing himself onto the electrified fence of his prison camp. Whether he did so from despair or as an act of deliberate choice is something we cannot know. Stalin, if he grieved, did not show it publicly. He was not a man who showed grief. So what do we do with all of this? How do we hold it together, the poetry and the purges, the warmth at the dinner table and the signatures on the death lists, the man who read Dostoevsky and the man who built the Gulag? I think the honest answer is that we hold it together with difficulty. We resist the temptation to simplify him into pure evil, not because he does not deserve moral condemnation, because he does, but because the simplification lets us off the hook. If Stalin was simply a monster, then the system he built was a monster's aberration, impossible to understand, impossible to repeat. If Stalin was something more recognizably human, a man of real intelligence and real capabilities, shaped by real experiences, who made real choices that could have gone differently. Then the question of how such things happen becomes something that remains urgent and relevant. The historian Timothy Snyder has written that the great danger of evil on the scale of Stalin's is not that it is incomprehensible, but that it is comprehensible, that it was built by comprehensible people using comprehensible logic step by step from comprehensible beginnings. That understanding is uncomfortable. It is meant to be, because the lesson of history is not simply, there was a monster. The lesson is about power and what it does to people and what it does to systems and what it requires from the millions of ordinary individuals who either resist it or participate in it. Stalin did not create the Soviet system alone. He did not run the Gulag camps alone. He did not sign the death warrants alone. He had help, enormous amounts of it, from people who made choices. We like to believe that, in their position, we would have chosen differently. History suggests that this confidence is, at the very least, something we should examine carefully. The young man who wrote poems in Gori, the seminary student who read Marx in secret, the underground revolutionary who organized bank robberies, the apparatchik who built files while others gave speeches, the general secretary who consolidated power no one saw coming, the wartime leader who refused to leave Moscow, the aging tyrant who signed death warrants late at night and then listened to opera, the man who was afraid, perhaps at the very end, afraid because he had spent his entire life knowing exactly what happened to those who lost power, and now power was leaving him in the only way it ever truly leaves anyone. That is the dark side of Stalin. Not just the crimes, as enormous and real and devastating as they are, but the human being inside them, the one who makes the whole story so much harder and so much more important to understand. Thank you for watching until the end of this one. It means everything to us that you stayed with this story. It is not an easy one to sit with, and we don't think it should be. If this video made you think, if it challenged something you believed, or if it confirms something you already suspected, please leave a comment below. Tell us what struck you most. Tell us what you disagree with. Tell us where in the world you are watching from, if you haven't already. This channel is nothing without the conversation that happens in the comments, and we read everything. And if you haven't subscribed to Dark History USSR, please do. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join a community of people who believe that understanding history, even its darkest corners, is one of the most important things we can do. There is so much more to come. The stories we have yet to tell you will not let you look away. Until next time, stay curious, stay honest, and never stop asking questions.